The night they judged my father. Not our kind of people. 12 guests heard those words. I heard them. My wife heard them. And my father heard them. Howard Brock was sitting beside me at my daughter Eleanor's formal engagement dinner, hosted by the family she was about to marry into. He wore an old blue flannel shirt, the same kind he'd worn for years. His hands were rough from decades of work, and he'd driven up from Dayton in his aging Ford pickup. Across the table sat Griffin Alderman, Eleanor's fiancé, along with his parents, relatives, and friends. They were polished, expensive suits, designer watches, private equity careers, vacation homes. My father looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a hardware store. And apparently, that was enough for someone at the table to decide he didn't belong. Waverly, Griffin's sister, leaned toward her husband and said it quietly. Or at least, she thought it was quiet. Not our kind of people. Then she glanced at my father. He looks like he wandered in from a hardware store. I looked at Griffin. He heard it. He didn't laugh. He didn't defend my dad either. That bothered me almost as much. My father simply kept eating. He had always been like that. He could absorb an insult without giving the person the satisfaction of seeing it hurt. But I couldn't. I pushed my chair back. The room went silent. I told them my father had raised me alone after my mother died. I told them about the long hours he worked, the sacrifices nobody at that table knew about, and the fact that he'd traveled hundreds of miles because his granddaughter had accomplished something important. Then I looked directly at Waverly. You don't know a thing about my father. Nobody answered. Loretta, Griffin's mother, looked uncomfortable. Prescott Alderman stared down at his wine glass, and Griffin finally looked at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't read. Embarrassment? Guilt? Or fear? I didn't know. I only knew I was done. Dad, I said, standing beside him, let's go. Howard folded his napkin. He thanked everyone for dinner. Then he followed me out. Outside, my father adjusted his coat and looked at me. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yeah, Pop, I did. He smiled faintly, but he didn't explain himself. Instead, he drove back to his hotel, and about an hour later, while we were sitting alone in the lobby, Howard went upstairs and returned carrying the same battered duffel bag he'd brought from Dayton. He placed it between us. Then he pulled out a thick manila folder. I had never seen it before. It contained old documents, contracts, and papers he'd apparently been carrying for years. I looked at him. What's this? Dad stared at the folder for a long moment. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Son, there's something about my life you never knew. He still didn't tell me the number. Not yet. But I was about to discover that the quiet man those 12 guests had dismissed had spent decades building something far bigger than any of us realized. And the strangest part? I was beginning to suspect that Griffin's family might have had a reason to be interested in my father long before that dinner, because they hadn't just judged the man sitting at their table. They may have completely misunderstood what he owned. Asterisk, asterisk. The secret behind the old folder. My father didn't open the folder immediately. He sat across from me in the hotel lobby, the worn manila folder between us, his coffee cooling beside his hand. I kept staring at it. Dad, what exactly am I looking at? He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the folder. Something I should have shown you a long time ago. That wasn't an answer, and for the first time in my life, I didn't let him change the subject. Then show me. He opened the folder. The first document was dated 1987. The name at the top stopped me. Brock Industrial Supply. I looked at my father. You own this. I started it. I leaned back. For 30 years, I believed my father had worked in manufacturing. I'd never known he had built a manufacturing company. He explained that he'd started with about $11,000 he'd saved while working at a machine shop. At first, it was just him, a couple of customers, and a small operation in Dayton. He supplied specialized components for agricultural and heavy equipment. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would make headlines. But Howard understood something I hadn't appreciated when I was young. He understood patience. Every time the company made money, he put most of it back into the business. Better equipment, more employees, larger contracts, more customers. By the late 90s, the The little operation had become a legitimate regional supplier, and somehow, while all of that was happening, he still came home and made dinner. He still drove an old truck. He still lived in the same modest house. And he still told me money wasn't something worth worrying about. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. Why hide all of this from me? He looked directly at me. Because I didn't want my money making decisions for you. I didn't understand. He continued, if you knew I had money, every difficult choice in your life would come an escape hatch. He paused. I wanted you to know you could stand on your own. That hit harder than I expected. You let me take out student loans. Yes. You knew I was struggling. Yes. And you could have paid everything. Yes. Why? His answer was quiet. Because I didn't want you making a decision because Dad could rescue you. I looked down at the folder. Suddenly, my childhood looked different. Not poorer. Different. Then I reached the section covering the sale of the company. The business had been sold in 2019 to a regional manufacturing group. The document showed a total transaction value of roughly $43 million. I stared at the number. That's what you got? Dad shook his head. That's the value of the transaction. My personal proceeds were different after the structure of the deal, taxes, and everything else. That distinction mattered. For the first time, I understood that the headline number wasn't money sitting untouched in a bank account. It was a value created by decades of work. Still, it was enormous. I looked at him. Why didn't you ever tell me? He closed the folder halfway. Because the money isn't the interesting part. I frowned. What is? He pulled out another document. This one wasn't about the sale. It was an ownership agreement. I read the company name twice. It wasn't Brock Industrial Supply. It was a separate holding company. What is this? Something I kept. I looked at him. You still own something? A few things. What things? He didn't answer. Instead, he tapped the document. After the sale, the buyers wanted everything connected to the operating company. I agreed to most of it. Most? He nodded. There was one asset I refused to sell. I looked at the document again. Why? Because I knew what it would eventually be worth. My father had spent decades thinking ahead, but then he said something that changed the entire conversation. The aldermans know about it. My stomach tightened. What? I didn't say they know about me. He pointed at the document. They know about this. Suddenly, the dinner came back to me, the questions, the way Prescott had asked what my father did. The way Loretta had watched him, the way Griffin had gone quiet when his sister insulted him, and that question I had initially dismissed as casual. What exactly did you do before retirement? Maybe it hadn't been casual. Maybe they'd already heard the name Howard Brock. Maybe they'd been trying to confirm whether the quiet man sitting at their table was the same Howard Brock connected to the asset in this folder. I looked at my father. Why would Griffin's family care about something you own? Dad took a slow breath. That's what you need to find out. Me? Yes. Why me? He closed the folder and pushed it toward me. Because this isn't about my money anymore, Daniel. His voice became firmer. It's about your daughter. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Eleanor had gone into that dinner believing she was celebrating her engagement. I had gone believing I was introducing my father to the family she was joining. But now I was wondering whether that dinner had another purpose. And if it did, I wasn't going to sit around waiting for Howard to explain everything. For the first time, I decided to investigate the aldermans myself. I started with Griffin, because before I could understand what his family wanted from my father, I needed to know one thing. Had Griffin known about Howard before Eleanor ever brought him home? What Griffin wasn't telling me. The next morning, I called Griffin, not Eleanor, not his parents. Griffin. I wanted to hear his side before I started making assumptions. He answered after 4 rings. Daniel? Hey, Griffin, you got a minute? Yeah. What's going on? I got straight to it. Did you know my father owned Brock Industrial Supply? There was a pause. Yes. That single word made my stomach tighten. How long? My dad mentioned the company a while back. Before Eleanor and you got engaged? Yes. Then why didn't you tell me? Honestly, I thought you already knew. I almost laughed. My father spent his entire life making sure I didn't know. Griffin was quiet. Then I asked a question that mattered. Why is your father interested in something my dad owns? Another pause. This one was longer. Daniel, I need to be careful here. Why? Because my father doesn't tell me everything. That surprised me. Griffin continued. He's always been like that. He thinks I'm better off knowing only what affects the family directly. I know pieces of what he does, but not the details. So what do you know? There's an industrial property outside Dayton. My attention sharpened. What property? I don't know the exact address. Do you know who owns it? Griffin hesitated. Howard. I sat down. What kind of property? An old industrial site. About 60 or 70 acres, I think. That was the first concrete piece I'd heard. I remembered the document from my father's folder. There had been a parcel number on one of the pages. I hadn't paid attention to it. Now I wished I had. Why does your father want it? I don't know everything, but I know the area has become important. How? There's a planned logistics corridor coming through that part of the county. Warehouses, transportation access, utilities. The land around there is suddenly worth a lot more than it used to be. I thought about my father saying, I knew what it would eventually be worth. Suddenly, those words made sense. Your father has been trying to buy it for 2 years. Yes. Why didn't he buy it? Because Howard wouldn't sell. I leaned back. Now, the pieces were starting to fit. Brock Industrial Supply had been sold in 2019, but Howard had kept this one property outside the sale. It wasn't required to operate the business anymore, so he had deliberately separated it from the transaction. At the time, it probably looked like an old industrial site with little importance. Years later, the surrounding area began changing, and suddenly, the land was valuable. But there was something I still didn't understand. How did your father connect that property to my dad? Griffin went quiet. Then he said, business records. What records? I don't know. My father had a file. A file on Howard? Not exactly. What does that mean? It was a file on the property. Howard's name was in it. I rubbed my forehead. So your father knew about my dad before the dinner. I think so. You think. Daniel, I'm telling you what I know. His voice had become frustrated. I wasn't involved in this. I believed him, at least partly. Then why was your sister making comments about my father? I don't know. You didn't hear what she said? I heard it, and you still didn't say anything. He sighed. I should have. There was genuine regret in his voice. Then he said something that made me stop. My parents didn't know you were going to leave. What? They thought your father would stay. Why would they care? I don't know. That answer bothered me. But before I could press him, Griffin added, Daniel, please don't assume the engagement was some kind of setup. I hadn't even said that. How did you know I was thinking that? Because I would be thinking it too. His voice softened. I love Eleanor. I didn't get engaged to her because of your father or because of some property. That mattered. Because the truth was, I had never seen Griffin as a bad man. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was simply a man whose family had started looking at something valuable and had forgotten that people were attached to it. Then when did your parents find out Howard was Eleanor's grandfather? I don't know. Guess. He was silent. Probably after we got serious. He finally said, my father started asking more questions about Eleanor's family. There it was. Not a conspiracy. Not some carefully arranged romance. Something much more believable. The engagement had been real. Then the Aldermans discovered who Eleanor's grandfather was. And somewhere along the way, they realized that the quiet older man they'd once considered insignificant was connected to the exact piece of land they wanted. I thanked Griffin and ended the call. Then I opened my laptop. I searched the property records using the parcel number I remember from my father's documents. The result appeared on the screen. Brock Family Holdings, LLC. I stared at it. Then I searched the development plans for the area. The proposed logistics corridor ran directly alongside the property. And there was something else. A major distribution hub was planned less than 2 miles away. The land wasn't merely valuable. It was becoming strategically important. I finally understood why my father had kept it. But one question remained. Why had the aldermans suddenly become so interested in buying it? I called my father again. Dad, I found the property. He was quiet. You found the one they want? Yes. And now you understand why I kept it. Partly. What don't you understand? Why are they willing to pay so much for it? My father gave a small sigh. Because they know something you don't. What? The development plan isn't the whole story. My pulse quickened. What else is coming? He didn't answer. Instead, he said, come back to Dayton. When? As soon as you can. Why? Because if you're going to understand what that land is really worth, you need to see it yourself. He paused. And Daniel? Yeah. Bring the folder. I looked at my laptop screen. For the first time, I realized that $43 million wasn't a real mystery anymore. My father had already explained where most of his wealth came from. Now I needed to understand what he had deliberately kept, and why a family I barely knew was suddenly willing to spend years chasing it. Because whatever was coming to that piece of Ohio land, Howard Brock had known about it long before the aldermans did, and he had been waiting for the right moment to reveal why. The land my father refused to sell. I drove to Dayton the next morning. I didn't tell Eleanor everything. Not yet. She was already upset about the dinner, and I wasn't about to dump a second problem into her lap before I understood what was happening myself. I simply told her I needed to talk to Grandpa. She knew better than to argue with that. By noon, I was pulling into my father's driveway. Same faded mailbox. Same porch. Same old Ford sitting beside the garage. It was almost absurd. A man who had spent decades building a successful company still lived in the same modest house. He'd raise me in. Dad opened the door before I knocked. Coffee, please. We sat at the kitchen table. I placed a folder between us. I found the property. He nodded. Then you know why I kept it. I know you didn't include it when you sold the company. That was deliberate. Why? Dad opened the folder and pulled out an old survey map. He spread it across the table. The property covered 68 acres on the outskirts of Dayton, an abandoned industrial yard, an old warehouse, a rail spur, and a narrow access road connecting it to the county highway. I pointed at the map. You've owned this since 1994? Yes. Why? He smiled. Because everybody thought it was worthless. That sounded like my father. He had never been interested in what something was worth today. He cared about what it could become tomorrow. When Brock Industrial Supply was sold in 2019, the buyers wanted the company's operating assets, contracts, equipment, and customer relationships. They didn't care much about the old property, so Dad kept it. I didn't need it to run the company anymore, he explained. But I didn't want to give away something I believed would eventually matter. I looked at the map again. Eventually, look at the highway. I did. Then I noticed the proposed transportation corridor marked in blue. The county had been studying a new route that would connect the interstate with a planned regional logistics hub. The project wasn't guaranteed. There were still approvals, funding decisions, and environmental reviews ahead. But the preliminary plans were far enough along that developers were already positioning themselves around the potential corridor, and the aldermans were apparently among them, so that's why they want to land. Partly, Dad pointed toward the northern edge of the property. That's where the important part begins. I frowned. What am I looking at? An access route. I looked closer. There was a thin line marked across the map. What is that? An easement. I stared at him. Dad explained that years ago, when the industrial site was being developed, he had negotiated a private access agreement connecting the property to the old rail corridor and county road. But there was more. The agreement included rights that weren't automatically transferred when Brock Industrial Supply was sold. Rights tied specifically to the parcel. Rights concerning access, utility placement, and future infrastructure connections. Dad had retained them personally through a separate holding company. I looked up. So the aldermans don't just need the land. No, they need those rights. Dad nodded. Now, the whole thing made sense. They could buy neighboring parcels. They could assemble investors. They could plan the distribution hub. They could spend millions preparing for the project. But without the access and infrastructure rights attached to my father's property, their plans would face a serious obstacle. They offered you $4 million. Yes. And you refused. Yes. $12 million. Still refused. I shook my head, because you knew they weren't really buying 68 acres. Dad looked at me. They were buying the ability to make their larger project work. That was the difference. The land itself was valuable, but the rights attached to it were what gave my father leverage. I closed the folder. Then another thought hit me. Dad, when did the Aldermans learn about all this? He looked away. Recently. How recently? Before your daughter's engagement dinner. My chest tightened. 6 weeks. He nodded. That's what Griffin said. Dad's expression changed. You talked to Griffin? Yes. What did he tell you? I explained the conversation. The file. The property. His father's interest. And Griffin's claim that he hadn't been involved in the details. Dad listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said quietly, Your daughter chose Griffin because she loves him. I know. Don't punish her for what his family may be doing. I won't. But don't ignore the possibility either. I knew what he meant. The engagement could have been completely genuine. Griffin might have had nothing to do with his parents' business plans. But now I had another question. Did Griffin know they had discovered who Eleanor's grandfather was? Did he know they had made an offer for property? And did he know that his parents were sitting across from the very man who could complicate their entire development plan? I pulled out my phone. I need to talk to him again. Dad nodded. Ask him what he knew before the dinner. And if he lies? My father looked at me. Then you'll know. Before I could make the call, Dad pulled one final document from the folder. It was a copy of the original access agreement. At the bottom was his signature, and beneath it was a handwritten note. I read it twice. Rights retained by Howard Brock and not included in any future transfer of operating assets. I looked at my father. You planned this. He smiled faintly. I planned to protect what I'd earned. Then he closed the folder. Now you understand why they were so interested in meeting me. I thought about that dinner. The questions. The staring. The insult about my father's clothes. The way Griffin had gone silent. Maybe they hadn't known everything. Maybe they were still trying to figure out how much Howard controlled. But there was one thing they clearly hadn't understood. They thought they were dealing with a retired businessman sitting at a family dinner. They didn't realize they were dealing with the one person who could hold up the most important part of their future project. And now I had to find out whether Griffin knew that too. Because if Griffin had known his parents were pursuing my father's property before he proposed to Eleanor, then I had a much bigger problem than an awkward dinner. The question I had to ask Griffin. I called Griffin before I left Dayton. He answered almost immediately. Daniel, we need to talk. There was a pause. About last night? No, about your parents. His voice changed. What about them? I know they've been trying to acquire my father's property. Silence. Then Griffin said quietly, You talked to Howard? Yes. And he told you about the development rights? He did. Another silence. I decided there was no point dancing around it. Did you know your parents had made offers? I knew they were interested. How much? I don't know. For $1 million? Silence. 12. Another silence. That was enough. You knew. I knew there had been an offer. My father doesn't tell me everything. Then what exactly did you know? Griffin sighed. He told me the property was important to a development project. That's it. What kind of project? A proposed logistics hub and transportation corridor. Nothing is guaranteed yet. That mattered. At least Griffin wasn't pretending the project was already approved. My father said your family was heavily invested in it. We're involved with some of the investors. But the project still needs approvals, financing, and other pieces to come together. So your family needs my father's cooperation. His property would make the project much easier. There it was. Not impossible without Howard. Just much harder. I leaned back. Did your parents know Howard was Eleanor's grandfather before the dinner? Yes. When? Several weeks before. And you knew? Yes. Did you tell Eleanor? No. Why? Because I didn't want business negotiations between our families to become part of our relationship. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But trust wasn't something I was willing to hand out anymore. You should have told me. I know. You should have told Eleanor. I know. His voice sounded genuinely frustrated. Not with me, with the situation. Then Griffin said something that caught my attention. My father told me one thing that didn't make sense. What? He said Howard wasn't protecting the land. I frowned. What was he protecting? I don't know. Did you ask? My father wouldn't explain. That was the first thing Griffin had said that felt genuinely important, because my father had said the same thing, without saying it directly. The land wasn't the real leverage. The rights attached to it were. I thanked Griffin and ended the call. I didn't trust him completely, but I no longer thought he was necessarily part of his parents' plan. He might simply be a man who had spent his entire life being kept outside his father's business decisions. Still, there was one person I needed to talk to. Eleanor. She answered when I called. Dad. Hey, sweetheart. Can I ask you something about Griffin? Sure. Before the engagement dinner, did he ever ask you anything specific about Grandpa? She thought for a moment. Not really. Think carefully. There was a pause. Then she said, Actually, yes. What? A few weeks ago, Griffin asked whether Grandpa still had the original property documents from his old business. My attention sharpened. What kind of documents? I don't know. He mentioned deeds, access agreements, something like that. Did he say why he wanted to know? He said his dad's company was studying some land in Dayton. And what did you tell him? That Grandpa kept everything. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. My father had always kept old paperwork, receipts, contracts, blueprints, letters, things most people threw away. But now I understood why that mattered. The Aldermans weren't simply trying to buy a piece of land. They were trying to determine exactly what rights Howard still controlled. I thanked Eleanor and ended the call. Then I checked my phone. A new message had arrived from an unknown number. Stop asking questions about the Dayton property. I stared at it. The timing bothered me. I'd spoken to Griffin less than an hour earlier. Whoever sent the message knew I had started asking questions. But the message wasn't threatening violence. It was something more calculated, a warning. And strangely, that made it more unsettling. I saved the number and put the phone down. Then I opened the folder again. I went through every document my father had given me. Property deed, old survey, operating agreements, access agreements, utility rights, development correspondence. I read everything twice. Then I noticed something I had missed before. A reference number appeared repeatedly on several documents. Easement Agreement 94B. I searched for it in the older paperwork. There it was. A 3-page agreement from 1994. I read the first page, then the second. Then I stopped. The agreement didn't simply give Howard access to property. It gave him control over a specific connection between the property, the rail corridor, and future utility infrastructure. And there was a clause I completely overlooked. The rights could not be transferred to a third party without Howard's written approval. I read that sentence again. Suddenly I understood. The aldermen could buy surrounding land. They could gather investors. They could push the proposed development through the approval process. But unless Howard cooperated, their plans would become considerably more complicated and expensive. And my father had known this for decades. I called him. Dad. Yes. I found Agreement 94B. He didn't respond. You knew exactly what you were holding. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to discover it when you were ready to understand it. I shook my head. You could have told me. I could have. Why didn't you? His voice softened. Because I didn't want you making decisions based on my money or my leverage. That was my father. Even now, he was trying to keep his choices from becoming mine. But then I remembered the message on my phone. Someone wanted me to stop looking. And I knew exactly what that meant. The aldermans weren't worried about Howard's wealth. They weren't even worried about the 68 acres by itself. They were worried about what Howard could legally prevent them from doing with everything around it. And now that I knew what Agreement 94B actually meant, I had one question left. Why had the aldermans waited nearly 2 years to push so hard for it? And what had changed recently that made Howard's old agreement suddenly worth fighting over? The next morning, I drove back to Dayton. I spread the deed, the 1994 agreement, the development maps, and the county plans across Dad's dining room table. For nearly an hour, I found nothing. Then I noticed the access road. It ran along the eastern edge of Dad's 68 acres and connected the property to proposed logistics corridor. I looked back at Agreement 94B. Suddenly, I understood what the aldermans were really after. They weren't simply trying to buy the land. They needed control over the access and infrastructure rights attached to it. The county documents made one thing clear. The logistics project was still only proposed. Several approvals remained. Funding wasn't final. Environmental reviews were still pending, and negotiations involving surrounding properties hadn't been completed. The planning office couldn't discuss private negotiations, but the public documents confirmed that access arrangements in the area remained unresolved. I didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. The aldermans were positioning themselves before the project reached its next stage, and Dad's property was one of the pieces they hadn't secured. I went back through the old agreement. The language was complicated, but one section stood out. Howard had retained specific rights involving access, utility placement, and future infrastructure connections. And those rights couldn't simply disappear because the surrounding land changed owners. Most importantly, certain changes affecting that access corridor require Howard's written consent. I sat back. There it was. Not ownership of someone else's land. Not some magical power over the entire project. A specific contractual right, but an important one. The kind of right that could make a large development considerably harder and more expensive to execute without the owner's cooperation. I finally understood why Dad had refused $12 million. They weren't paying for dirt. They were paying for certainty. And Dad wasn't selling it. Then I found something that made my stomach tighten. A copy of the original agreement had been included in one of the alderman's legal files. I checked the date. It was recent, very recent. I stared at the document. How did they get this? I called Dad. He answered after 2 rings. Son, Dad, the aldermans have a copy of Agreement 94B. Silence. Not the normal pause he took when thinking. This was different. For the first time, Dad's voice lost its usual calm. They shouldn't have that. That's what I thought. That agreement wasn't part of the public development file. Then how did they get it? I don't know. Could someone have given it to them? Possibly. Who? He didn't answer. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Then he said, there were only a handful of people who had access to the original. Your attorney? Yes. The surveyor? Yes. Anyone else? Dad hesitated. One other person. Who? The attorney who handled the company sale in 2019. I looked at the documents on the table. The timing suddenly seemed important. The aldermans knew about the property. They knew about the proposed development. They knew about the access rights. But somehow, they had also obtained a private agreement that wasn't supposed to be in the public records. That wasn't something I was willing to dismiss as coincidence. Dad, I said, do you think someone from the old company sale gave it to them? I don't know, but you have a suspicion. Another pause. I have several. That answer bothered me more than a name would have. Before I could ask another question, Dad said, Daniel, be careful about accusing people without proof. I know. And don't assume everyone connected to the aldermans is part of this. I knew exactly who he meant. Griffin. I had spent enough time talking to him to realize there was a difference between knowing something was happening and knowing why it was happening. But I still had questions. So I called Griffin again. This time, I didn't ask about the property. I asked about his father. Did Prescott have a meeting yesterday? Yes. With the development group? I think so. Do you know what they discussed? Not exactly. I waited. Then Griffin said, I heard something afterward. What? My father said they needed to settle the Howard Brock issue before the next development review. When is that? Next week. I stared at the documents. Next week. That explained the sudden urgency. The project wasn't guaranteed, but the developers were approaching a stage where unresolved access rights could become a serious problem, and Howard's cooperation mattered. What exactly did your father say? Griffin hesitated. He said they couldn't keep carrying the uncertainty. What uncertainty? I don't know. Then his voice dropped. But I heard him say one other thing. What? He said, find out who gave Brock the old agreement. I went completely still. Your father said that? Yes. I thanked Griffin and ended the call. Now I had two separate problems. First, the aldermans wanted Howard's cooperation before the project advanced. Second, they were trying to find out how Howard had retained those rights in the first place. And that raised a question I hadn't considered before. Maybe they weren't simply trying to buy the rights. Maybe they were looking for a way around them. I looked again at Agreement 94B. The consent clause was clear, but there were other provisions. I began reading every page from the beginning, slowly, line by line. Then I found a reference to an amendment dated 2003. I searched through the folder. Nothing. The amendment wasn't there. I called Dad again. Did Agreement 94B have an amendment in 2003? He didn't answer immediately. Yes. Where is it? I have it. Why wasn't it in the folder? Because I didn't think you needed it yet. I stared at the table. Dad, what does the amendment say? His voice became quiet. It changes a consent provision. How? I'll show you when you get here. Dad, just tell me. No. Why? Because once you understand what that amendment does, you'll understand why the aldermans are worried. I closed my eyes. The pieces were finally beginning to connect. The proposed development, the access corridor, the consent requirement, the private copy of the original agreement, the mysterious amendment, and someone inside the old circle of people who knew about it. I had spent the last few days trying to figure out what the aldermans wanted from my father. Now I knew, but I still didn't understand the most important part. What exactly had Howard changed in 2003, and why would that single amendment be enough to threaten a development worth millions? The secret my father had protected for 23 years. When I got back to Dayton, Dad was already waiting at the kitchen table. The 2003 amendment lay between us. I picked it up. What does it say? Dad looked at me. Read it. I unfolded the document. The amendment changed one critical section of Agreement 94B. The original agreement required Howard's written consent for certain changes involving the access corridor. The 2003 amendment clarified that requirement. If the property became part of a larger development requiring that specific corridor, Howard's written consent would still be required, even if surrounding parcels changed owners. And that consent couldn't simply be transferred to someone else. I looked up. So they can't just buy the land around you and ignore this. Not without creating a serious problem for their plans. I read the amendment again. It wasn't some magic document that gave Dad control over the entire development. It was much simpler than that. He held a specific contractual right, and that right gave him a seat at the table. The aldermans had the original agreement, but they didn't have the amendment. Someone had given them one piece of the puzzle, not the whole thing. I looked at Dad. Someone gave them the original agreement, but not this. Dad nodded. That can't be coincidence. I wouldn't assume that yet. That was my father, always careful, always leaving room for facts. He explained that the amendment had been properly executed in 2003 and preserved the consent provision even as the surrounding property changed hands. That meant the aldermans couldn't simply purchase neighboring parcels and pretend Howard's rights didn't exist. They needed a negotiated solution. I finally understood why they had been pushing so hard. But I still had one question. Why didn't you tell me about this 23 years ago? Dad gave me a tired smile. Because you didn't need to know. That answer is getting old. I know. He leaned back. When you were younger, I wanted you to build your own life. I didn't want my money, my company, or my decisions influencing yours. I looked at him. So you hid everything. I protected your freedom. That hit differently. For years, I thought my father had simply been secretive. Now I understood. He hadn't wanted me depending on something I hadn't earned. He hadn't wanted me choosing a career because I knew there was a fortune waiting for me. He hadn't wanted my relationships shaped by his name. And suddenly, the dinner made me angry all over again. The aldermans had judged him without knowing anything about him. Worse, they had assumed they could eventually pressure him into giving them what they wanted. Dad looked at me. Call them? You want me to? Yes. I made the call. 2 days later, we sat across from Prescott Alderman and his attorneys in a private conference room. Prescott arrived confident. His confidence lasted about 30 seconds. Dad placed the 2003 amendment on the table. One of the attorneys picked it up. He read the first page. Then the second. His expression changed. He leaned toward Prescott and whispered something. Prescott looked at Dad. You still have this? Dad nodded. You should have checked whether the original agreement had been amended. The attorney looked back at the document. This changes the consent provision substantially. Prescott's jaw tightened. What do you want? Dad didn't hesitate. I don't want to sell the property. Prescott stared at him. Then what are you proposing? A limited easement. The room went quiet. Dad continued. A defined access route. Specific utility rights. Temporary construction access where necessary. Nothing beyond what the project actually requires. And the property remains mine. And the other rights remain mine. Prescott leaned back. You understand this project represents a significant investment. I do. And your cooperation affects more than just my company. Dad nodded. Then you'll understand why the agreement needs to protect both sides. One of the attorneys asked, What are your conditions? Dad slid a prepared document across the table. They're all there. The attorney began reading. No unrestricted access. No transfer of Howard's retained rights. No use beyond a defined corridor. Compensation for the easement. And protection against future expansion without additional consent. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a trap. It was business. Fair business. The kind my father had been conducting his entire life. Prescott looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at Dad. You could have demanded far more. Dad smiled. I could have. Why didn't you? Because I don't need to punish people to prove I'm right. Nobody spoke. Finally, Prescott signed the preliminary agreement. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside, I walked beside my father toward the parking lot. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then I asked a question I've been carrying for years. Dad, were you ever going to tell me about all of this? He smiled. Eventually. That's your answer? Yes. I laughed. He laughed too. Then he became serious. I didn't hide my life because I was ashamed of it, Daniel. I know. I hid the money because I wanted you to become your own man. I looked at him. And now you're old enough to know the truth without letting it define you. That was when I finally understood my father. The $43 million had never been the most important thing. The company sale hadn't made him powerful. The land hadn't made him powerful. Even the rights he protected for 23 years hadn't made him powerful. What made Howard Brock powerful was that he had built a life where he could say no. No to people who underestimated him. No to people who wanted something from him. No to pressure. And no to letting money decide who his son would become. As we reached the car, I thought about that dinner. 12 guests. One careless sentence. Not our kind of people. They had looked at my father's old jacket and decided they knew his worth. They were wrong. But my father didn't need to humiliate them in return. He simply showed them the truth. And the truth was enough. As Dad opened the car door, he looked at me. You know what the best thing about money is? I smiled. What? You don't have to spend it proving you have it. Then he got into the car. I stood there for a moment, watching him. And I finally understood why he'd kept his wealth quiet for so long. My father hadn't spent decades building a fortune so people would admire him. He'd built it so nobody could decide his worth for him.